This video is brought to you by Shelter-Rite. Visit Shelter-Rite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. In this video, we'll be building a trailering boat cover for a powerboat. In order to quickly complete the project, we will sew panels of fabric together, then pattern the actual fabric on the boat. We will then reinforce the edges for fasteners and sew binding on the raw edges. No hemming is required. This video will also show installing the Stayput shock cord cover clips, snaps, boat vents, and a zipper opening for easy entrance and exiting while the cover is on the boat. For our boat cover, we picked a very water-resistant fabric called Top Gun 1S from Shelter-Rite. We will also show you how to install a zipper for quick access to and from the boat while the cover is still in place. For good air circulation under the cover, we'll also be installing some vents. Let's get started. Here's Brian to show us how it's done.
Okay, now on this boat, when I did the enclosure, I used the pull the dot one-way snaps up here on the windshield. I did that partially for the enclosure. I didn't want air to come up, blow the panel up. More importantly though, I did that because with the trailering cover, I also don't want air to come up and pop them off. So these will be the one-way snaps across the front windshield. Then down the sides, I already have standard dot fasteners that run down the sides of the boat. That's for the enclosure, and also the old trailering cover followed that. And then on the back, we've got the Stayputs. Just in case maybe the boat's new to you and you've never had a cover on it, and you see that you've got these snaps. These two snaps you can see look very similar. In fact, they're very close in size. If you took a standard dot snap, which this is a standard dot, also called a dot durable. Some people just call them a standard marine grade, but this is a dot durable snap. It is its own specific stud. You could take this socket and it might snap onto this stud. It would not be very secure. It also is not proper. This is a pull the dot or a one-way snap stud. Very similar in size, shape, and even profile, but the difference is the pull the dot will only open if you pull it one direction, whichever way you orient the button. Now, the socket for this snap absolutely will not go onto this one. So you do want to identify what you have before you start. The identification here is standard dot fasteners or durable or marine grade are round. These have a hexagonal shaped base, which I don't know if you can see or not, but they have little squared edges, kind of like a stop sign. And that's just a quick identifier to know which type of snap you have. One thing to point out is the original snaps, which were installed on the boat, and I actually replaced all the ones on the other side last year. It took a while, and I may get around to doing these this year, I may not. These snaps were installed on the boat when I purchased it. You can see how loose these are. Okay, they're riveted on. That's how they did it, probably at the factory. Then this snap, I put these on last year because I went to the pull the dot snaps. You can see these don't move. They're nice and solid. You can also even see the paint is chipped away all around them, where the old snaps sat there moving all over the place. The reason is that we use the Snap-Rite surface mount stud die to install these. The surface mount stud die is the only thing I've ever seen that will allow you to actually rivet a snap rigidly onto the boat. And we'll probably replace at least a couple of these as we go, just so we can show that. One other thing I want to talk about on this boat, the trailering cover for this boat is specifically going to be a trailering cover or a short-term storage cover. It won't be a long-term storage cover. It also won't be a cover that's used when the bimini is in place. The bimini for this boat is an aluminum frame bimini. Also, with the bimini mounted up high on the windshield, I really don't ever want to trailer the boat with the bimini in place. It's easier just to remove it. The bimini actually stores very nicely up here on the dash area for trailering. So the reason I mention that is because I do want this cover to be as watertight as possible. So I'm not going to be making cutouts for where all of these bimini mounts go. If you have a boat where you do plan on leaving the bimini frame, even if it's folded back, but plan on leaving the bimini frame in place, you will need to make cutouts or boots. We'll show that, that's actually shown in our pontoon cover video. But for this particular video, we're not making those cutouts. The other thing we're doing here is I'm actually not going to make recesses for these fittings. These fittings will stand proud a little bit. Because I'm not making cutouts or making recesses or accommodations, I will definitely need to reinforce these areas because there will be a lot of wear on that. That'll be a sharp object. So we're going to put Shelter-Rite reinforcement underneath the cover to help protect it from the fittings wearing through. What we're going to do is we're going to start by measuring the boat. So we're going to take one tape measure, we're going to attach it to the forward point of the cover, and we're going to go aft to the back portion of the cover here. I'm just going to kind of clamp things in place here. On the aft portion of the boat, we're actually using, you can see I've got the Stayput fastener knobs there because we'll use the Stayput shot cord cover clips. That'll keep the back down. We could go to these snaps. If we did that though, what would happen is going down the road, we would have a tendency for the cover to want to blow up and open. So we're going to go down those Stayput fasteners. 14 foot, 8 inches. Okay, what I've done to help facilitate the measuring is I drew basically a rough sketch of the flat cover. Basically I've got the boat itself where it comes along the windshield here, and then this line here would be this railing, and then the cover is actually going to go down below the railing. So I just wanted to get that way I have a general shape. All we're doing now is we're measuring so that we can cut and sew up our panels to cover the to make the general cover. Okay, now what we're going to do is each panel is going to be just shy of 60 inches because we're working with roughly a 60-inch width fabric. So we would start with the front would be panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, so on. So we're going to start, we're going to come back to about 5 foot, figure out what our widest portion will be, which will be right here. Right now I'm going to measure just across the top of the windshield. We'll be adding to that. So that measurement there is 77 inches. Okay, then we're going to go to the second section, which will be roughly between 5 foot and 10 foot. Now, obviously we're going to be wider back here than we will be up here, so we want to once again go to our widest portion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure across the railing here. Actually, I'm going to come up just a little bit here, right about in the middle of it, because this will actually be a little bit longer. So across the railing is going to be 84 inches. Then railing to snaps will be an additional 16 inches. Then our third panel is going to be back here, and we're going to basically get, we're going to have to use a panel in just a little bit, but this last panel, basically I can just look at the boat and I know that this last panel's width is going to be about the same as the second panel. Okay, I'm double checking my measurement here, and where we're going to be falling with the end of our cover is just a bit between 14 and 15 feet. And so we're basically going to make this work out of just 3 panels. We could add another strip to go all the way down, but because we're using the shot cord cover clips, I can have the end of my cover fall basically anywhere here. So we're going to work with what we have and make that work. Okay, now we've got our fabric rolled out. We've calculated that we're going to use about 13 yards for this particular project, so we've got that pulled out here. What we're going to do is we're going to start by measuring out the first panel. Now the first measurement, remember we measured 77 inches. That was at the top of the windshield. I'm going to go ahead and add 3 inches on each side of that, so I'm going to actually cut this one at 83 inches. What I'm going to do is I want to mark the center line of each panel. I also want to mark where each panel goes. I'm going to do that on the bottom side. And so this is panel 1 forward. I'm going to go ahead and make a matching mark here.
To do this same procedure for all of the panels for your boat. we're going to move ahead.
This is panel 1, aft. Okay, what we're going to do here is we're basically going to make a mock-up of one of our seams. We're going to do this for two reasons. One, I want to show the reason we orient the seams the direction that we do. Also, I want to have this as kind of a sample as I sew to make sure I'm going the right direction. So as you can see, I made basically a mock-up of panel 1, panel 2, 4 aft, 1 and 2. Basically what's going to happen here is the aft edge of panel 1 is going to match up with, of course, the forward edge of panel 2. So in a semi-flat felled seam, the first step is to sew the two face down. We're using a 1/2 inch seam here, and I've got my sewing guide in place there.
For this project, we're using the Shelter-Rite UltraFeed LS1 sewing machine. It's set up in the Shelter-Rite UltraFeed industrial sewing table.
Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to open this seam up and we're going to sew it down. Now the key here is, on this particular boat, panel 1, 2, and 3 all lie in a slope and slope down. 1 is the highest, 2, then 3. So in this particular boat, we want the seam to go this way. I'll show that after I sew it. And so now what you can see is we've got our seam there and then our top seam. The reason we did it this way is because we want to shed water. What we've got is, we've got basically like the shingles of a roof, if you can see the end there. So the water would come down and off. If we went the other direction with it like this, you could see that we would funnel all this water towards our seam, and we would basically be relying just on the seam stick to keep water from going straight into the boat. Once again, this particular boat, all 3 panels are in a slope. It would be possible that maybe there's a forward panel. If we were going over the windshield, the panel that goes from the windshield forward would probably slope forward, so we'd actually want to turn that seam the other direction. Okay, we're going to go ahead and baste our first panels together. So what I have here is panel 1, and I've identified the aft edge of panel 1, which is what we're going to apply the basting tape. And the reason we're going to do panel 1 currently is because panel 1 is narrower than panel 2. And so if we did panel 2, we'd do a whole lot longer of an edge than we're actually going to be sewing. For this particular application, we are using, once again, basting tape 129, which is the 3/8 inch basting tape for canvas. It sticks quite well. And the reason we're using 3/8 of an inch is because we are doing a 3/8 inch seam stick. Then we're going to actually sew a 1/2 inch seam. And so our tape will be completely inside. It won't be outside exposed to the elements. Our second stitch, our top stitch, will go through the tape, and that'll help seal the needle holes. Actually, well, let's see. So now what I want to do is find the forward edge of my panel 2, which I've already identified. Let me get it up here. This fabric is so slippery. I'm actually going to stick some weight on it. Hopefully it will keep it from moving around on me as much. Now earlier, I'd made these marks. What these marks are is this is marking the center of the panels. That way I can line things up as we go. So I want to go ahead and expose our tape. And I'm going to start from the center here.
Brian is carefully lining up the raw edges as he bastes. If it's off, the nice thing about double-sided tape is you can peel it back up and reapply it.
And one thing I should note is we did use scissors to cut this. Now with the Top Gun 1S, the coating will help keep it from unraveling much. It will still fray just a little bit if you really pull at it, but the coating will hold it together. If you were using an acrylic or a polyester that was not coated, you would definitely want to use a hot knife. And you still could use a hot knife with this, but for ease, we used scissors. Okay, we're going to start by sewing our first seam where we're sewing the two panels together. And for this, what we're going to do is we're going to set our magnetic sewing guide here at a 1/2 inch. So that'll help us get a nice consistent 1/2 inch seam.
We're going to be sewing our cover with a PTFE thread called Profilen. It is a lifetime thread and is not affected by the sun or even normal chemicals. Profilen PTFE thread sews better in the Shelter-Rite ultrafeed sewing machine than any other PTFE thread we've tested.
Now it's important you want to try to keep this seam as straight as possible. This is why we're using our magnetic sewing guide, because this seam and its straightness will really make up the shape of the cover a lot. As you can see, I'm really not feeding the fabric through the machine. All I'm doing is keeping it straight and making it available, and the machine is feeding it through.
Our Shelter-Rite ultrafeed sewing machine is set up in the Shelter-Rite ultrafeed industrial sewing machine table.
Before I finish sewing, then I want to go ahead and get my sample out, because I want to recall which direction which seam is going. And basically what I'm going to be doing here is panel 1 is going to be having the edge folded under. So what I want to do is start there with panel 1 with the edge folded under.
This illustration shows the seam that we will be sewing.
Now, it might be easier for some to roll the fabric. This fabric is pretty easy to stuff, so I'm actually just going to stuff it in the machine. And once again, I want to check my sample, take a quick look there, and remember that I'm folding under. What I'm going to be doing here is I'm actually going to be using the edge of the foot as my guide. Now it's important as you sew here that you're careful not to sew through something you're either not supposed to, or also make sure that you're actually catching that entire seam. So I'm reaching under with my hand here so that I can ensure that the seam is going the correct direction. And I'll need to check that periodically as I sew. This is a seam where it's not bad to take your time.
Be sure to reverse to lock the stitch in place when you first start sewing. Notice that as Brian is sewing this top stitch on the semi-flat felled seam, he's pulling the two panels apart so they are splayed open at the first stitch as he creates the top stitch.
And once again, the reason I'm going in little short segments here is I'm actually feeling through the fabric. I should probably check every once in a while under the fabric. And I'm doing two things. I'm keeping my seam pulled taut, and I'm also keeping the part that we're sewing through underneath in the proper place.
We're sewing this cover with the Shelter-Rite ultrafeed LS1 sewing machine. The Shelter-Rite ultrafeed sewing machines are the world's best portable walking foot sewing machines. Thinking about purchasing an ultrafeed, or do you own one? You may want to think about purchasing the Shelter-Rite ultrafeed industrial sewing machine table as well.
Now, the reason we use a semi-flat felled seam on a project like this is one seam is exposed to UV. The other seam is actually hidden. Now, of course, we're using Profilen thread, which is virtually impervious to UV damage, so I wouldn't expect that thread to ever fail. But if we were using a polyester thread, which over time will degrade in the sun, once that seam would happen to fail, you do still have this seam here as a backup. You can see underneath, we do have two seams that are parallel. This seam is the initial seam where we sewed the two panels together, and then this seam is where we did our top stitch, bringing up the bottom. We're going to be face up on the table because we're basting the fabrics face to face.
The fabric is rather slippery and wants to move off the table, so we use a heavy object like this mallet to keep it from moving.
And so now I've got the aft edge of panel 2. So we want to go to the forward edge of panel 3. And I'm just going to lay it up in place here. I need to go ahead and apply my basting tape first. Okay, now what I'm doing is I'm lining up my center line marks. Okay, as I'm lining up my marks, once again, I just want to double check, make sure I am in fact going with panel 2 aft to panel 3 forward, because I could accidentally base this to panel 1 and wouldn't be very happy.
We've already shown how to sew the panels together, so we're quickly going to skip over this portion of the video as we join the other panels together. But before we do that, Brian wants to touch on one thing that may happen. Here's Brian.
Okay, Eric and I were talking instead of me paying attention to what I was doing, and you can see that my stitch got a little bit off there because I came off of my guide. Now, if we take and fold this out and do our top stitch where we're at right now, things won't really look as good as they should. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to where it's straight, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just put another stitch in there, much the same way. I'm going to be a little bit more cognizant of what I'm doing this time, and I want to keep this stitch straighter through here. Now, this one wasn't so drastic that we really had to do this, but I wanted to demonstrate how to fix it if you do happen to get out of sync. So what we've done there is now we have that second seam, but because that second seam is straight and it is on this side, when we open this up, you'll never ever see our mistake right there, and we'll have a nice straight edge. Okay, what I'm doing right now is I'm rolling up panel 3, the panel that's going to be going through the throat of the machine, just to kind of make life a little easier on myself. I'm still going to have a mess at my feet here. Now, you'll notice I have my sample out again because I want to pay attention as I go. Remember, this is panel 1, panel 2. I'm working with panel 2, panel 3. So this will help me remember that I want to have the underside folded this direction, once again, so that way we shed water the proper direction.
After all the panels are sewn together, we'll take them back to the boat and we'll use the actual fabric for the patterning of our cover. That's coming up next.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to be applying basting tape to the windshield here and basically all the way around the boat, so that way we can actually stick the fabric to it. We don't just want to stick basting tape straight to this. It'll be just a mess to get up. So what we're going to use is the filament strapping tape. It's pretty strong, sticks well, but most importantly, it'll be easy to peel up. So we're going to start, and we're actually putting this row, we're going right beneath the snaps. We're doing that so that way we get a nice, clean, flat line to press it into. What we're using for the basting tape here is our part number 129. It's a 3/8 inch basting tape for canvas. The basting tape for canvas has a fairly strong adhesive to it. I'm just going to go right across my strapping tape. Now back here is going to be a little bit different. The cover is actually going to come down and go just a bit low of the rub rail. So the easiest thing for me to do here is to go right on the rub rail. That's probably going to be the lowest point there.
When using the actual fabric to pattern, it's sometimes necessary to rig a support system for the overall weight of the fabric. When the fabric is draped over our boat, the center will sag quite a bit. So Brian is using that strapping tape to create a support for the extra heavy weight of the fabric so that it will not droop down and be easily removed from the double-sided tape as it's basted around the perimeter. A second helper would be very nice at this time. At certain spots, you'll need a few spring clamps. That will help hold the cover on as we prepare to pattern.
Okay, what we did with the strapping tape was we basically we fitted up a little bit of a general kind of ladder frame out of the strapping tape, so that way the cover would have something to rest upon. The basting tape will hold the cover in place and hold it in position for final patterning, but it can't support the weight of all the cover, so we need something to support the weight. Right now, it's going to sag down a little bit. Once we put a center support in, it'll actually tent it a little bit so that the water runs off like it should. Now really, this would go best if we had a second person on the other side. We could basically start at the windshield and kind of walk our way back. But we don't have a second person on the other side, so I'm basically going to get this side into position, then I'll move over and get the other side. And I know I'm going to be putting a dart here, so I might as well just go ahead and put a clamp there right now. That'll just help keep things in place. This isn't necessarily how my dart will be, but I just know I need to clamp it. Put a clamp in there. Okay. What I'm doing now is I'm going back and around the windshield area, I'm actually putting a second row of my strapping tape, basting tape combo, because after sticking to the tape a couple times, I just wasn't able to get the cover as tight up here as I wanted. So we're just going to give it some more surface area to stick to. So we can pull it nice and tight. And having the cover have a little bit of sag in the middle isn't terrible, but at this stage of the game, what will happen here is every bit of sag that we have in the cover, we will have to turn into lift later, basically with the poles. So if we make a cover that's too saggy, we'll end up having to put poles in that make it even taller, which may not necessarily be all that bad, but I do want to keep this cover a little bit lower profile since it is a trailering cover. As I'm doing this, I am also putting a little bit of thought as I go into where I'm going to be placing darts. For instance, right here, I'll be placing a dart right here at the corner of the windshield.
A dart is used to take up excess fabric, especially at a turn or an obstacle. Sometimes cutting out or away the extra fabric at a transition can help the cover to rest better on the boat. Here, Brian is trying to determine if that will take place here by cutting out the extra fabric at this transition.
Here, I can cut this off though.
So now, because that extra fabric has been removed, hopefully this will baste down a little bit more smoothly.
Now we have things basically, we've got everything basted in place. We're pretty happy with the fit where it's at. So it's time to start tracing our lines and understand where everything's going to go. Especially right here, because it's kind of an odd turn with the cover. I am just going to make a little mark where each of my snaps are, because I want to make sure I don't miss any snaps here, and it'll also basically help me really understand where the line is. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and trace our line. This is going to be our cut line, and what we're doing is we're basically staying below the snaps just a bit. Now, I'll probably be straightening this line out with straight edge, especially through here, but this gives us a general idea of where we're supposed to be. Okay, now here at the back, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a lot of meat out and putting a dart here. So what we're going to do is take our clamp and we're going to kind of roll some of this. I'm going to get basically my points together where I want it to be, roll this up a little bit, and then I'll place my clamp right there at what will be my dart. Because what we're going to do is we're going to sew this right here to create a dart, and that will close up the aft corner. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and put a couple pins in here for my dart. I'm doing this for two reasons. One, to kind of create the dart, but more importantly, so that way I've got a definite, because I'm going to scribe a line on the inside and the outside, and this will tell me from one side to the other where my line's at.
The line that was struck down at this aft corner on both sides will be our stitch line, where our dart will be created. Now he removes the pins.
Now this line here, I'm going to bring it down, because this is basically going to be this aft corner. And I've got a stay put right there. And the old cover basically ended right at the rub rail. And I was pretty happy with that, so I'm going to do the same thing.
The marks on top of the snaps will not be where we will install snaps. They are just for reference.
So here, coming around the corner of the windshield here, and I figured that my dart is going to go right here. So while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and scribe my dart. Now here, I could probably pin it, but because I'm against the windshield, I can also just fold it over and get a pretty good line. These are not, I'm not marking my snaps for final placement. I'm really just marking the snaps so that I know where they're at as I'm scribing this line, and also as a point of reference before I cut, I can be sure I'm in the right spot.
The snap installation will be done with the cover put back on the boat after it's been cut to size. Now we could remove the cover and fair up the lines. That's coming up next.
Okay, a couple things that we're going to be doing now that we're back off the boat is one, I've got, I traced the lines with the chalk on the boat, and that worked somewhat well. Some of these lines I want to go ahead and retrace. Now this particular one, this is where we're going to be adding the dart. So I'm just going to retrace that line for our dart. And I also want to pay careful attention to what I do and don't wish to cut at this point. I'm going to write little notes here. So this is my dart, and this is the starboard aft. And this line here goes across the transom. I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. Now, if we were hemming this, we would need to add some additional fabric here, but we're actually not hemming this. What we're doing is we're choosing to reinforce the material, and then we will be adding binding at the end. And since we're using the binding, we also don't need to worry about our edge being hot knifed because it will be bound. Now, at the corners, what was basically going to happen is we're going to be sewing in our dart, and this corner is going to come into about here. We've got an additional bit of material that comes down, so I do recall that from it. So I know what I can do here is I can just take and cut off that excess material. When we sew in our dart, then we'll trim along that line and everything. But for now, we'll just get it out of the way. Now I'm coming to the other side, and I'm going to do much the same thing. I'm just going to square up my dart line here. Now this line here, I had a little bit of an issue. I actually moved it, but that was why I marked my snaps, was so that way I would really have a good idea of where everything was. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to use the lines that I have from my snaps and also the line that I scribed, and I'm going to make myself a little bit better line to cut along. That way I have a nice straight line. One, it will look better, and two, it will actually make things a whole lot easier when we're adding our Shelter-Rite reinforcement. I'm going to do the same thing here. And the reason we're using two different things to mark this is the material we're using, the Top Gun 1S, the coated side. The nice thing is stuff comes right off of it. The hard thing is it's a little bit hard to mark with. What I found is the Scriball pencils, they work really well if you're against a hard surface. But on the boat, we weren't necessarily against a hard surface. If you try to do something like that, they don't even mark. So that's why we were using the chalk on the boat, but here where we're on the table, we're able to use a Scriball. It works really well.
Our cover is now cut to size. Next up, darts.
Okay, we're getting ready to do our first dart here. Now this dart is the aft portion of the boat. Basically the back is very square. So what we're going to do is we're going to mark on the back side of the fabric, because that's actually we're going to be sewing. We're just going to mark each end of our dart. And all I really need is just one little reference point here. Now what I'm going to do for our dart here is I'm going to start by laying basting tape next to my sew line. I don't want it on the sew line, because if I put it, since we're doing a dart, if I do it on the sew line, what'll happen is I'll have basting tape that's sticking out. If that happens, it just becomes a dirt magnet. Not a big deal. You can, sit there and pick it out. Now what we're going to do is I've marked, remember I made my points out here, and then I have already traced my lines. That way this is going to be my seam line, so I can see it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here at the corner. And so I'll put my finger right there, and I'll take this other one, and I want to pull it fairly taut, get it where it goes, and then just smooth the whole thing out. And so that'll become my dart. Okay, now here I'm going to scribe a line at 3/4 of an inch, because I'm going to leave an additional 3/4 so we can do a semi-flat felled seam there.
The line that Brian struck down, the 3/4 inch line, could be a 1/2 inch as well.
And then here I'm going to go ahead and...
He cuts over to where the tarp actually comes down to a straight line. This is immediately under the dart.
Okay, and for my first seam, I'm going to sew right on this line that I scribed.
At the beginning and the end, do some reversing to lock the stitch in place.
Now what I'm going to do is I want to open it up here, and I'm going to sew the second edge down. I'm actually going to turn it this way. Now normally for your top stitch you would do your top stitch on the top, but I just found that it was a little bit easier because of the way that this stitch stops. Just a little bit easier to go ahead and do it from the inside out.
This top stitch will be about an 1/8 inch away from our first stitch.
And what I'm going to do, I want to make sure everything's pulled straight and make sure that this is pulled taut to make my seam there. And I'm going to use the edge of the foot as my guide, following the other seam. now when we flip it open, we've got our corner, and we've got our seam, and then our top stitch there, and our chalk that'll all come off.
Now for the smaller darts.
It seems like a deeper dart. Okay, now when I top stitch this, I'm going to remain consistent through my project, and I'm going to fold both top stitches aft. And I'm going to put my foot down, and I'm going to use my original stitch as a guide.
Follow this procedure for all the darts for your cover. We're going to move on and get ready for edge reinforcement. But before we do that, Brian wants to discuss a little bit more about this dart.
And stitching this down probably wasn't terribly important, because when I do my edge reinforcement, I'm actually going to cover that area and have other seams through it. But this will just help keep things in place when I go to do my edge reinforcement. Okay, now I'm going to be doing my edge reinforcement. And this is twofold. This is basically just to add some weight to the edge. This will also give me something more robust to install my snaps through. I'll basically then have a layer of the Top Gun 1S material, and then also the Shelter-Rite. Now, some people like to use webbing for this. We have really encouraged everyone to use the Shelter-Rite material. The reason for that, it doesn't add a lot of weight or thickness, but it is very, very strong. Also, it doesn't shrink or add a lot of seam pucker like webbing would. If you get a thick webbing in there and you go to sew it, a lot of times you get a lot of pucker. Yeah, also, if you're doing fasteners such as twist locks and whatnot, sometimes webbing's a little more problematic to cut through. Because this is a nice, smooth, firm fabric, it's a little bit easier to cut through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some basting tape right onto the vinyl. And I'm using shorter pieces today just because you don't need to trim the edges of this or anything, and we have a lot of short pieces left over in the bin after we ship all the long pieces, so I'll be using those today. And what I want to do is I want to base this down, and I want to get as close to the edge as possible. I want to keep my tape, my Shelter-Rite tape, nice and straight.
Brian has opted to put only one strip of the double-sided tape on the Shelter-Rite. However, applying 2 strips on each long edge will adhere it better to the cover.
Actually, what I'm going to do here, because there is a little bit more contour than I thought there was there, so I'll just take and trim that off, and that way I can just kind of continue to follow.
Edges that have a transition or curve can sometimes be dealt with by cutting short strips of the Shelter-Rite tape and trying to match the edge shape with those short strips. However, when a curve gets extreme, it's best to cut your own facing piece, and we'll be showing that soon.
In this area I have that dart right there, so there is a little bit of shape, but what I did is I ended the one there and overlapped it. So then I'll just trim it out now. We can trim it now, or we can trim it when we go to bind, but I'll trim it now just so you see it. And so remember, we'll be sewing that down. And then when I'm sewing, I want to pay attention to this, because when I sew here, I want to make sure I'm coming across here, and then I, go right onto there. If I'm sewing here, I want to make sure I start to cut over, otherwise I'll end up getting to the end of that and have nowhere to go. But we'll cover that as we sew. Now here you can see I've got some curve there. So what I'm going to do is, once again, I just kept my Shelter-Rite straight. I'll trim that out before I bind that edge. Okay, in this particular area, you can see we used our straight cut facing. What we're going to do here, we're going to go ahead and trim this so that we have our edge. Okay, and this area has quite a bit of curve to it. So what we're going to do there is we're actually going to trim out a facing. That way we can follow the curve. And I'm really just concerned with the curved area here. So first step is to trace my edge. And then I'll cut that out. Now we're going to take our canvas patterning ruler and we're going to use it to create a line that runs parallel to our cut edge. And I do that just simply by putting it in the hole and follow along. And now we can trim this out. Okay, the result is a 3-inch facing that perfectly follows the contour of our cover. So I can take and baste it into place.
Since we cut this facing to match the curve perfectly, this facing will be an exact representation of that curved edge. So any drastic curves or edges that you want to be perfect, this is the way to do it.
I actually made that a little long. We'll just trim that off. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this last section. Now, obviously I have a lot more cover to go around, but this is a fairly large cover, and so as I take it from the table over to the sewing machine and I'm manipulating it, I don't want to have a whole bunch of pieces to fall off, so what I'll do is I'll just work with, you know, one big section of the cover at a time. So I'm going to baste this one last section and then we'll go sew it.
If you were to baste all of the facing strips to the cover and then take it to the sewing machine, you would find that a majority of them would probably fall off the cover while you manipulate it to sew those in place. So we recommend doing these strips in sections, maybe 10 to 30 foot in length, and then sewing those on and then taking it back and basting more on. The inside edge of our facing is sewn with a straight stitch, about an 1/8 inch from the raw edge of the Shelter-Rite facing strips. Transitions are dealt with by burying the needle, lifting the foot, rotating the fabric, lowering the foot, and then continuing to sew. We will be installing a binding around the outer edge in a later step. Here we're sewing that reinforcing strip where it was cut to follow the curved edge of the cover. That length of reinforcing strip has been sewn. Now we'll take it back to our table and baste more reinforcing strips until we get around the entire perimeter of the cover. We're going to skip ahead now. Coming up next, we're going to sew a 1-inch binding around the perimeter of our cover. A binding can be installed easily around the perimeter of our cover using the 1-inch swing-away binder from Stayput. Brian makes a few adjustments to the binder stitch. You can do that releasing this thumb screw here and then move the binder in or out to get the stitch closer to the edge or further away from the edge. And we can do some reversing because the swing-away binder will swing back as we do a little bit of reversing and then swing forward back in its normal position. For Top Gun and Top Gun 1S, we recommend using top-notch 9 binding. That's what we're using here.
Now as I'm going, I am watching what's going towards the binder. Like right here, I have a little bit of the Shelter-Rite material hanging off, so I'm going to trim it off. Also, I am just going to slightly round this, just ever so slightly. It'll make binding it a little bit easier. Now as you're sewing, using the binder, it's easy to get lax, because the fence with the binder, it's easy to just push the material against it and say, okay, it'll feed fine. But what's important and what you need to remember is it doesn't matter what's going on back here. What you really need to be focused on is what's going on at the needle. If you're focused on what's going on here and you allow the material to slide over, you can very easily run right off the edge and wonder what's going on. Well, the reality is you're just simply not paying attention to what you're doing. So as I go, you'll notice a lot of what I'm doing is keeping the material pushed over towards the fence, not so much as it enters the binder, but as it exits the binder, because that's where it's most important. And here I've got another area where I've got this Shelter-Rite that's poking out just ever so slightly. So I want to go ahead and trim that so that way I have a nice smooth edge.
The Stayput Ultra Feed sewing machine and the Stayput 1-inch swing away binder makes it easy to install binding on the edge of a fabric application. Get yours today from Stayput. Anytime you have a long length of binding that needs to be sewn on, it's a good idea to keep track of your binding to make sure that it is not kinked up before it gets to the binder attachment. That's what Brian did just then. Here is a 90-degree turn. Watch what Brian does to handle it.
Okay, we're going to cut our binding just a little long, and we're going to go ahead and sew about as close up as we can get with the binding attachment in place. Okay, then we'll pull a binding attachment out. And now we've got our binding here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take our hot knife and we're going to cut a slit in the binding. And we'll also dress the ends of the binding a little bit. Then what we can do is just take our binding and fold it over like that. And then much in the same regard, what we're going to do is we're going to start our binding. We're going to feed it through the binding attachment, and we're going to cut a slit
The end of that binding with the slit is slipped over the opposite end that we just cut off, and then he'll sew it securely in place there. Don't worry, the tails will be cut off. They will not be left there.
And when we get to this end, we just go right off the end. Now what we'll do is we'll take our hot knife and we'll carefully trim this up to match our other binding. And then we'll do the same here. You can see I'm folding my cover material back as much as possible to keep it out of harm's way.
So that is almost a 90-degree inside turn. Now, what do we do with the 90-degree outside turns? That's coming up next. We've already cut the end off of our 90-degree outside turn, so we'll just feed that up into the binder and sew directly over that end, reversing to lock our stitch in place. And that's how you handle a 90-degree outside turn as well. Here we're coming to another 90-degree turn. This is an inside turn. The binder is swung out of the way. A notch has been slid into the binding already. We did not show that. And then he will sew over the beginning end of the binding where he started sewing, reversing several times to lock the stitch in place. It too is trimmed with a hot knife very carefully not to burn the cover. And at the 90-degree outside turn, ends are cut off and then touched up with a hot knife to prevent them from unraveling. Now our binding is sewn all the way around the perimeter. Up next, we'll be installing the Stayput shock cord cover clips. That'll be to the aft section of the cover. To accomplish this, we need to roughly position the cover.
Okay, now what we're doing is we basically brought the cover to the boat. I clamped it up at the bow and then just kind of brought everything around as I went to make sure everything seemed to fit in the general location we'd hoped. Now, we're obviously going to be pulling a lot of this slack out with our snaps. But what we're trying to do right now is just make sure that everything still fits good like we'd hoped. Now, we are going to be coming back and doing some chafe protection areas like this, but what we're going to do is on this particular cover, we're going to go ahead and set our snaps first. What that'll do is it'll allow us to get our chafe protection exactly where it needs to be. You know, for instance, if I looked at it right now, I've got this rail would be right here. Well, when I patterned it and marked it, the rail was clear up here. When I put my snaps on, things will probably completely change. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set up our Stayput fasteners. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to make my mark basically directly above each Stayput area. This one I'm going to come inbound just a little bit because I want to make sure I'm pulling outward. Okay, there's two ways to install the Stayput fasteners. One is to use a hole punch, or what I prefer to do is to use the Stayput spin cut fastener. I like these because they're a lot easier to use on board. In conjunction with the cutting board, you can hang that on your wrist. Basically, just come up right behind where you're going to cut. And you're not waking up the first mate, the neighbors, the dog. Okay, now the old knobs from the old cover were clear down here because it had really long straps. So what I'm actually going to be doing is I'm going to be moving these knobs up, and I'm actually going to go right into the bottom edge of the rub rail with them. So I'm going to take out the old knobs and I'll epoxy over these holes later. And when selecting a proper drill bit, what you want is you want a bit that when you hold it in front, you can only see the threads, you can't see the body.
These knobs can be installed on a flat, or should I say horizontal surface, like the hull of the boat. Here Brian is installing them at a 45-degree angle underneath the rub rail. This will still allow us to accomplish snapping the shock cord over the knob.
Okay, so there's three components to each fastener. There's the loop, the outer cap, and the inner cap. First step is to take the loop and push the ferrules in firmly into the outer cap. When you do this, you want to make sure that there's not a twist here. See, I got a little bit of a twist because I want it to lay nice and flat. So we'll try again. Much better. Then we take our backer and we push it up through. And notice what we've got is we've got two layers here. We've got our Shelter-Rite, and then we've also got our cover material. And just go ahead and start it by hand to get it into place. And you can hear it click once. Then what I'm going to do is you can use a mallet, or I'm actually going to use channel locks here. And I'm going to line my channel locks with Shelter-Rite material so I don't scrape up the fastener itself. And I want to keep it straight down. and it'll usually go 3 or 4 clicks. I want to try to keep it straight there as I go. Twist it into position a little bit there. There we go.
Okay.
And so then we take that, just loop it on.
These Stayput shock cord cover clips are just one option of fastener that can be used here on the aft end. You could use snaps, you could use common sense fasteners, you could use lift the dot fasteners, and other fasteners as well. On the remainder of our cover, we're going to use snaps. That's coming up next.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to position the center pair of snaps. To do that, I'm going to utilize our Quick Fit kit. Now, the Quick Fit kit is really designed for use with a standard dot snap. These snaps up here are, in fact, pull the dot snaps, but as you can see, a Quick Fit or dot socket will snap onto a pull the dot. It's not as secure as we would want it to be, of course. And the Snap-Rite will work as a snap positioning tool as well, but the Quick Fit will allow us to do 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 snaps at a time. So we're going to use it for this particular application. So I'm going to set my center to, and I just push the material down over. And if you want, you can go ahead and put the caps on. We'll keep the material captive, and we'll also keep you from poking yourself. And we're going to go ahead and do the next one. And I should mention that these do stay snapped a lot better on a standard snap than on these pull the dots. And then our next. All right, for this particular application, we'll be using the standard button die in conjunction with the stud die. So I'll start by putting my mandrel in place and put my snap. Now you'll notice that pull the dot snaps have basically a little flap that's on the inside. That's what facilitates the movement of them. So I'm going to go ahead and install that on the flat side. And now what we have is this tip that sticks up here needs to face the direction you want to pull the snap from. There's also a line on the die here that correlates with that. So we'll install that, and we'll turn that so that it's properly in place. And then we're going to take our pull the dot button, and what we want to do is the word dot basically is the side we're going to be pulling from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in basically with it facing towards the handle. So first I'll remove my Quick Fit. And then carefully make sure that I'm using the same hole I was, or that the Quick Fit was out of. There we go. And check to make sure the tip's facing the right direction. It is. Slide that down. And squeeze. Typically it'll take 2, maybe 3 squeezes. You don't want to break the mandrel. You really, after time, you'll get to learn feel. That feels pretty good. And we'll take that off. And we look there, it's fully rolled, we're in good shape. Okay, the reason that we're going this direction is, yeah, we might catch a little bit of air coming up the windshield, and that could go like that. But more importantly, the cover will have a tendency to balloon and flop. Once it does that, if we were facing backwards with it, the cover would want to come forward or come up and pop the snap right off. This way, when the cover comes up, no matter how hard it's pulling, it's not going to get that snap. You've got to pull from the right direction to get that snap off. On a typical windshield like this, sometimes you would use pull the dots, sometimes you wouldn't. This particular boat has pull the dots all the way across the front. Since we can't use a standard dot socket on this, we've got to go with the pull the dot in this position. This windshield is like super overkill on snaps. Okay, so we've got our Quick Fits in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and basically do across the windshield here. So I'm going to put each one into position, set a cap on it to hold the snap in place. And the reason I'm pulling down on the outside here is obviously going to make sure I have enough material to get all the way over. So I'm just working across the whole side of the windshield at once. I'm pretty happy with all that. And if you weren't happy with anything, it's easy to reposition, but I like those where they're at. So I'm going to go ahead and put caps on to hold things in place. And then also the Pull the Dot has the word dot on it. We want to go ahead and have the DOT face down with the handle. And the score is also facing down. And we're gonna get this, we get right into our hole we made with a quick fit. Now I should note that you don't need to make a hole prior to this. You can make a hole with the mandrel, but we have a hole that we're really using as a marker of where our snap goes. So we want to make sure we match that up. Once again, check to make sure my score is facing the direction I want it to go, and start setting the snap. And you'll get to learn the proper feel of where a properly set snap is. And we'll slide that off and snap it in place. Now we're going to use the the press and snap fastener tool for one of these. I really just want to show the difference in the two operations. Now the press and snap it's a little bit easier to use. It's a one-handed operation, but the one thing about it is the die spins freely. Okay, so once you get it oriented, it may or may not move around on you. The same with the top. Now at this stage of the game, I don't have any clue where my dot is, other than remembering I did face it this direction. The other thing about the press and snap is when I go to get this here, I've got to really work hard to make sure that I'm getting things in my marked hole. And I believe I've got it there. As you can see, it sets the snap easily, and hopefully it's in the right position, which we're not too far off. Okay, now we're moving over to the side. We're going to go ahead and use our quick fit installation tool again here to make things fit, hence the name Quick Fit. Oh, notice how these go onto the snaps a bit tighter over here. That's because these are marine grade snaps over here rather than being the Pull the Dots. So on these, I'll need to use the removal tool. And always remember to put your button on, or your socket on. So do be very careful as you go to make sure you don't forget your the proper tools, or proper fasteners. We're moving on down the line. Now I should note here that what I've done is I've got, so far I've got these same snaps are done on the other side. What I like to do is I like to do 3 or 4 snaps down each side and then go over to the other side, do 3 or 4 snaps down each side. That way you're keeping everything symmetrical. If you go all the way down one side and then do the other, would probably be okay, but I just like to alternate as I go. And once again, the holding caps would probably be important if you were doing a lot more than 3 or 4 of them. The quick fits stay in this material pretty well, and I'm not moving it about too much, so I'm not putting the holding caps on.
If you don't like the position of the quick fit pin, you can reposition.
Okay, and I think I'm actually going to reposition that just a little bit. I can see that wrinkle there, so take a little bit of that out. There we go. Okay. At this stage, it doesn't really matter which one of these I do first, so I'm going to go ahead and do this one first.
Once the snaps are secured and the cover is snapped down into position, it's time to make marks for chafe protection patches, possible vents, a possible zipper, and support poles. That's next.
All right, we're getting ready to mark any place that we think will be important for chafe protection. So I'm starting by removing the lines that I put on earlier.
Those lines were put on with chalk.
What I'm looking for here is any place where the cover is going to rub on objects that stand proud, such as here. There's a deck hinge here, and so I want to make sure we have plenty of chafe protection around that area.
Some fabric marking pencils or devices may mark well on some types of fabrics. Others they may not mark at all. And the same thing goes with how easily they are removed from fabrics. Stayput recommends you test a marking device before using it on your project to be sure lines can easily be removed.
Okay, and while we're on the boat, I'm going to go ahead and mark the approximate position of my vents. Draw on the general bell shape of it. It's a lot easier while it's on the boat to determine the placement and orientation of it.
This cover will utilize some vents along the port and starboard side and one at the rear so air can escape when it's being trailered.
Okay, now what we've done is we've covered the boat, and I'm placing the poles in what I'm thinking would be a good approximate position for said poles to tent the cover. I want to make sure when it's sitting it gets adequate runoff. Looking at it inside, it'll pool right here. So I want to maybe try going back a little bit. And then I think I might pull this one back slightly. Now you might notice that this pole is off center. That is intentional. It's because this boat with the layout, the pole can't go directly in the center because the helm's there. So we're actually going off center a little bit, which really isn't a problem as long as you're not going to tent anywhere or pool anywhere. Probably should have done it from the other side, but I think I can get to it.
Now Brian marks each one of the positions for the cam lock support poles with chalk.
And lastly, we'll have our zipper. Now, as far as the zipper goes, I'm going to position it right about here. And I'm really going to draw kind of just my general line. I'll straighten things out. And I want to do the same up here. And the biggest thing I want to mark here is my stop point. Basically, what I'm going to do for my stop point is I just want to stop it where it's easy to reach from the transom, or from the platform here. The whole purpose of this is just to have the ability to easily open the cover, get into the cover, close the cover behind myself while it's on the trailer if I need to, if I'm working on the boat or whatnot. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to get the cover on and off from inside the boat. This way, you would cover the whole boat and then could still crawl through the hole to get in or out if you need to.
Now the cover can be removed and we can start installing all of those components. We'll be installing the Vent Air vinyl ventilator available from Stayput. One will be mounted on the port and starboard side and one
Okay,
aft.
first step is to apply the basting tape to the clamshell vent.
We do not want bugs, birds, or rodents to have free access through the hole that we will be installing in our cover. So we will use a vinyl mesh called Viphertex to prevent their access.
And it does stick really, really well to the rubber, so good idea to get it where you want it first. We're going to pull off our backing.
These vents are made from a tough, pliable vinyl that snaps back without damage, even after being flattened or folded.
You want to go about a little bit less than 1/4 inch from an edge. You want the edge to be fairly straight. And as you can see, you can adjust how deep you want or wide you want the vent to be. So get it positioned about how you want it. And then apply it to the Fifertex. Then we take our scissors and just trim out alongside the vent. Okay, then we're going to take our basting tape and do the same thing with the basting tape here on the Fifertex. And I'm only going to do basting tape behind the clamshell vent. If I did the basting tape across the bottom, you'd have exposed adhesive and it would be a dirt magnet. Okay, now we get our cover, which I had previously marked the position where we wanted the clamshell vent. So we expose our basting tape. And then stick it down. Now the key is to pull the bottom taut so that it lays flat. So the key is everything should be flat. Okay, now we're ready to sew it on. Whoops, actually I'm going the wrong way here. I'm going to start at the bottom on the side. And you want to make sure everything's still flat here. Drop our foot down. And I'm going to sew with the edge of the foot against the raised portion of the clamshell vent.
Presser foot's toe on the right side of the Ultrafeed LS1 is smaller in width than the toe on the left side. That's why Brian is sewing with the vent on the right, so the stitch is a little bit deeper into the flange of the vent. At the top of the vent, notice we're going to pivot on the needle.
To the top there, we're going to pivot.
He buried the needle, lifted the presser foot, pivoted, lowered the presser foot, then continues to sew.
And once again, make sure you keep everything flat as you go. And you'll notice I did my back stitches before I got to the Fifertex. I want to keep those on the rubber, and I'll show why in a moment. Now we go ahead and pull out.
Now we need to sew the bottom edge of the Fifertex. Watch what Brian does here.
Okay, now here what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set my foot down right on top of the vent. And I'm going to start my stitch just basically right at where the bottom of the opening is. And right now I'm just sewing the Fifertex to the cover material. And once you get about halfway across, bury the needle, lift the foot, and then work across the vent so you can complete sewing.
You'll notice that the vent compresses, so the left toe is on top of the vent, but we're only sewing through the Fifertex.
Okay, and we'll slide that out. Okay, we're going to go ahead and for this, we're going to use our edge hot knife. Now we'll need to install the cutting foot. Now with the cutting foot, if you have the 2 screws that are out here, this bottom screw is going to get the foot mounted to it. When you do that, it may not make good connection with the blade. So what we need to do is use one of the included extra screws and put it in the side of the blade there. I should note we're doing all this with the hot knife unplugged. So we'll tighten that down, and then we can loosen this screw and slide our foot into place. And you want your foot set so that the blade is past the edge of the foot, but not sticking out the bottom. And then start to tighten it down, but don't get it too tight yet. And then you need to make sure that it's centered in the foot. Now you can see that it's angled there. That's no problem, okay? That's easy to fix. Just grab the blade, just twist it just slightly. Oops, I went a little too far there, because the blade does move fairly easily. So just twist into the proper position, we're ready to go. Now it's really easy to see on the back that I stopped just a little bit short. The reason I did that is because I'm not worried about the fiber text that sticks out the bottom, but I don't really like the corners there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully trim away and round off those corners. Now carefully grab that and just make sure you're only grabbing the cover material, that you're not grabbing the fiber text. And just cut yourself a little snip. Now we can take our hot knife, and because we're using the cutting foot, we won't cut the fiber text beneath.
We're going to show this process in double time. If you do not have a hot knife like this, you could cut it out with scissors. The edges of Top Gun 1S will ravel slightly, but since it's covered with a vent, they will all be hidden. If scissors are used to cut out the vent, be sure your cut is about a 1/4 inch away from the stitch.
Just be really careful you don't burn the rest of your cover while you're doing this. There we go. And we've sealed the edges so they won't unravel.
We'll be installing 2 more in this cover, but that's all there is to installing the Vent Air vinyl ventilator from Shelter-Rite. This one's the medium size. Next, for our cam support poles, we'll sew the sewable boat vent pole caps in place.
First step is I need to find my marks I made for my pole vents. Let's see, that is, what is that? That's the windshield. So I should find a pole vent right about there. Okay, so we'll take our ruler and our awl, get the center with my awl, and I'll be making a 3.5 inch hole, which means I need to find the hole that is 1 3/4 inches away from the center, and that's going to be my trace line. And I just work that around. And the result is a circle that is 3.5 inches in diameter. Take it, trim out my circle. Okay, now we have cut our hole.
Around the perimeter of the hole, we'll use the Seamstick basting tape for canvas.
Okay, now we'll take our vent and put it into place. This is actually a little easier to do if you flip it over. What we do is we just start working the fabric into the groove. Get it in all the way around. Okay. Then we flip it back over, and our fabric should be nice and flat. Kind of twist it a little bit to see. Look good. And then we'll find the end of our basting tape. And we'll pull that out to expose the adhesive, and then press it down tight. And once we're all done, just double check. Make sure we're still in the groove. We are. We're ready to sew. Okay.
The vent cap is more towards the center of the cover, so we have to push a lot of fabric into the throat of the sewing machine.
Feed our cover in.
The throat size of our ultra-feed sewing machine is not huge, but as you can see, you can still fit a lot of material underneath the arm of that sewing machine.
Okay, now we're sewing with the vent in the throat of the machine because the foot is narrower. With the bracket on the outside of the foot, if we were trying to sew outside the throat, that bracket would be in the way. We could go to a zipper foot, we'd still have the same problem. Now, what we've learned here is this plastic is extremely dense. So what we found is that we went up to a number 20 needle. And once again, we're using Profilen threads. We're using a number 20 needle, which is a little large for the thread. We also had to increase our tension tremendously above what we normally would sew. And that's to get enable the needle to pull the thread up back through the dense material.
Take your time here and slowly sew around the flange. Here he wants to take a sharper turn, so he'll bury the needle by rotating the balance wheel, lift the foot,
Lift my foot and twist things a little bit here.
and then twist it around. And before he sews, he'll lower the foot and continue to sew.
Now what I'm trying to do is, as I sew, I'm trying to just make minor adjustments as I sew. If I do anything major adjustment-wise, I'm lifting my foot so that the material can pivot.
And when he lifts the foot, he ensures that the needle is buried in the fabric so it doesn't move.
And I'm trying to sew as good of a circle as possible, but sometimes, especially with something like this, you just got to get close is good enough. Okay, now I need to reposition my material here a little bit because I'm starting to get afraid I'm going to sew under it, or sew over the underside.
Again, the needle's buried while he's doing the readjusting.
Yeah. Okay, now that we've got it sewn down, you can see that I didn't really follow a perfect circle, and that's because of some of the adjustments here and there. I want to make sure I caught all the material because I got in a little bit too far there, but I think we're still okay. Let's take a look here. And what I want to look at is, yeah, I can see my seam comes in, but I still have plenty of material. Remember, I'm going all the way to that flange. Now, everything looks really pretty good. You can see I've pulled the stitch up pretty far. That's because we increased that tension quite a bit. Also, what we learned is if you're twisting everything all at once, and if you're twisting the material independent of the vent itself, you will also have a tendency to get loose stitches. This one actually looks pretty good though.
Don't forget to loosen up your tension back to where it was normally, now that the sewable vent caps are installed. Next up, chafe resistant patches.
Okay, now we're going to move on to chafe protection. And what I've got here is this corner. What I did was I basically traced the outline of the area that was going to be a problem. Now, this seam here signifies that I already have Shelter-Rite material under there. So what I'm going to be most concerned about is getting this other area covered here. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut a square patch that will cover that area. A little squarer than that. Like that. Okay. Then we'll take our basting tape, and I'm going to go ahead and baste. I want to do on the perimeter of this because I am actually going to sew it down through the basting tape, and the basting tape will help seal my needle holes. I'll take and fold this open, and basically I was just covering this area right here. Double check, yep, that covers everything. Now I've got the next area that I marked, that was right there. Just square the end of this up. And so I'll cut another piece that basically will comfortably cover that area. Okay, once again, we look at our area. Basically, I'm just centered around that snap, so I'll fold it open. And I've already got chafe protection there, so I'm most concerned with getting outside of that area. Okay, now for this particular seam, you can see I've got this snap that's right there. I need to avoid that, so instead of starting my seam there, and coming around, I'm actually going to start my seam here. And that way I'll be headed towards that snap instead of away from it. It won't really matter. Okay. If my needle would turn. And drop my foot.
The whole point here is basically we want to sew all of the chafe resistant patches that we put on our cover on the underside around the entire perimeter. Shelter-Rite vinyl is an excellent chafe resistant patch material that you can use on the bottom side of any cover. Pretty self-explanatory. However, we need to discuss what to do with patches that have a little bit of shape in the cover. Here at this corner there's a dart, so let's see how Brian handles that.
Okay, now the last step of this portion is we need to add chafe protection to the sides. Now, in most of the areas it was pretty easy. We were just able to add square patches, not a big deal. But here in the corner becomes a little more complex. A square patch isn't really going to work. What we need to really protect is we need to protect around the rail corner, and most importantly, there's a bimini fitting that's right here that's up on the top. So we need to protect around the corner and on top. So to do that, we're going to we're going to cut. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut first one strip of Shelter-Rite. And just to make things a little easier, I'm going to run the basting tape all the way across on both of those. And then we'll cut it in half, because we're actually going to use 2 patches here. And we are going to use the basting tape on all 4 sides here. Okay, now the first patch we're going to do is basically we're going to do the around the corner. So we want the material flat on the one side, and flat all the way around. Okay. Then we take our other patch, and then for this one we want to look at our cover, get our orientation right there. And what we're concerned about here is more forward. And it's okay to overlap them just a little bit there, like in the corner. But if we try to use one piece of material and fit it into form in that corner, it'd be pretty complicated. So now we'll take it and we'll just sew both these down. And sometimes it's easier, especially on a big cover like this. You can turn your material, and rather than going forwards, it might be easier to go backwards. And I'm actually going to do the same this direction too.
Moving on ahead, here's what it looks like when Brian is done. We'll do this to all chafe areas on the cover. For easy access into our cover, we're going to add a zipper. That's coming up next.
Now we're to our zipper portion. What we're using for this particular application is we are using the AquaGuard zipper. We're using that AquaGuard zipper for 2 reasons. One, it is far more waterproof with this vinyl coating. Also, it's going to be more UV resistant than the nylon. So what's going to be happening here is we're actually going to be sewing on the back side, not on the front. So we'll be on the back side with this, and the zipper will be sewn to the bottom, and so this will actually be the top. Now, we're going to go ahead and we had previously marked the line that we wanted to follow with our zipper. What we're going to do is we're going to transfer that basically to the other side of the material. Where'd my line go? Right there. And in the form of 2 dots. And we can flip our material over. So what I actually want to do is I want to move over 1.5 inches from my mark.
Moving over 1.5 inches will allow us to baste the Shelter-Rite, which is 3 inches, down the center of the line where we want the zipper installed.
Same thing up here, we want to be 1.5 inches away.
So we'll be able to use the edge of the Shelter-Rite along this line that Brian will strike down.
We'll go ahead and trace our line. And then we'll take our 3-inch Shelter-Rite tape, and we're going to go ahead and apply basting tape to it. And what we want is we want the shiny side facing the material. Doesn't really matter which way, but we're just going to try to remain consistent here. So we'll roll that off. We'll cut that. And we can apply basting tape now to it.
Be sure the basting tape is on both sides of the Shelter-Rite for installing zippers.
The reason that we made this mark 1.5 inches away from where we really want to be is because we're going to take this Shelter-Rite, which is 3 inches wide, and we're going to line it up alongside the line. I like to just expose one side of the basting tape at a time. Just makes things easier, especially on a big piece like this. So we'll stick it down all the way down there on one side. Then we'll go ahead and expose the basting tape and make sure everything's nice and flat, and just go ahead and get it stuck down there. Take our zipper, and we're actually going to make our zipper just a little bit long here.
This is a continuous length zipper, not a finished zipper. A continuous length zipper does not open up like a zipper on a jacket.
We're going to apply the basting tape to the front side.
Whereas a finished zipper opens up. We do not need a finished zipper here, since the inside end will never separate.
Okay, now I've got my canvas patterning ruler. What I'm going to do with it is I'm going to mark 2 lines. I'm going to mark one line that is 3/4 of an inch from the edge. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put a line that is at 1.5 inches. Now we've got those lines on there. We'll actually be using those later, but now's a good time to trace them. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sew down along the edge of our Shelter-Rite material.
Because basting tape was applied to both long sides, the Shelter-Rite material should stick in place as we take it to the sewing machine and sew.
Okay. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. We're going to go ahead and slit our material, and this is the reason I have the line in the center. It doesn't look center. Eric keeps accusing it of being off-center. It's a trick of the eye because of the other line. And as I slit this, I am realizing that I should have traced the same line I traced here. I should have traced on the other side as well. But we can come back and do that. Now as I go, I want to stop a bit short of, I stopped about 1 inch short of the end of my Shelter-Rite material. I did that intentionally. Now that we've got that slit, let's go ahead and we'll get this other line. I believe it was 3/4 of an inch from the edge. And the reason we're putting this line here, is it will help us to line up our zipper. later on.
Before the zipper is basted down, we need to sew on binding on the 2 cut sides.
Now, right here we're going through a lot of layers, so I'm actually going to roll this by hand. And then I need to back tack here.
The Ultrafeed can actually do this quite well under normal power, but notice as he turns the balance wheel, it's difficult to get that needle to go through that thickness.
As you can see, we've got a little bit of accumulation of stuff from our basting tape, just you know, goo, and really you can just kind of wipe that off periodically. You can put a little bit of oil on there, that'll help, but really at the end of the day, if the machine's in good tune and you're using the proper size needle and thread for your application, it really shouldn't affect much.
When he sews the binding all the way to where the cut starts, he will stop and cut the binding and start again on the opposite side. Why? Because we'll be covering that spot with a patch and it'll hide all that.
Okay, what I want to do here is I want to cut my binding so that it will end pretty much right at the end of my material.
It is not uncommon to sew and not know that you're out of bobbin. We didn't even know it here. Watch. That can be easily fixed just by reinserting a new bobbin and then sewing on the portion that wasn't sewn. Again, the end of this will be covered with a Shelter-Rite patch, so it doesn't really matter what it looks like here. To sew the opposite side, we'll flip the cover and work with the underside facing up. Same procedure when we reach the end.
Okay, if we were using polyester thread, what I would do is I would just cut these tails off with my hot knife, and I'd cut right through the thread and everything. But using the Profilen thread, it won't cut very well with a hot knife. So I'm actually going to cut the tails off and all my dangling threads, and I'll come back and trim those later, or I'll come back and seal those with a hot knife. I still have my foot in place, but that's all right. It won't really affect anything. I'll just go right above it here. And I'm just going to seal the edges there. Okay, normally when you're doing a zipper like this, what you would do is you would baste the zipper down in its entirety to whatever you're working with. In this particular application, trying to keep everything basted down and together is going to be pretty tough to do. So we're just going to go ahead and separate our zipper. And the reason we did this line is because it will enable us to take our zipper and baste it down. And we're just going to follow that line. Now I want to take my zipper and go not quite all the way to the top of my Shelter-Rite. And what I'm doing is I'm following that line that I scribed.
Lining the zipper's flange to the line that was struck down will place the zipper's teeth right inside the edge of the binding.
Now I scribed that line as half of the zipper distance without the binding in place, okay? So the binding actually added a little bit of distance there, so what'll happen is that'll actually make a little bit tighter seal with the binding, will help to hide the zipper as much as possible from UV light. And now we'll do the same with our other side.
Actually, an AquaGuard zipper with the vinyl coating is very UV resistant, but it's still good to hide a zipper from the UV exposure whenever it's possible. And that's what this binding will do.
Okay, now we're ready to sew it down. And I'm going through a lot of layers here at the beginning, so I'm going to do my first couple stitches here by hand. And the machine will punch through that if you want it to, but you just have a little bit more control and less likelihood to break a needle. Now I'm through that, we can just go ahead and sew away. And I'm just sewing with my foot right along the zipper as a guide.
At the top here, where the zipper ends, do some reversing. On the top side, this will be covered with vinyl.
Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and just kind of turn things around here a little bit.
When sewing the next side of the zipper on, try to do it on the same side of the presser foot that the first one was sewn on, because this sewing machine, the Ultrafeed LS1, has a presser foot that is different sizes on the left side compared to the right side. So the teeth are again on the right side of the presser foot.
Okay, and as I get to this binding, I'm just going to go ahead and do that last stitch by hand.
So, as we did at the beginning, we want to reverse, and here at the end, which is actually the beginning of the zipper, we want to do some reversing there as well. We're done.
Okay, the reason that I left these long was actually intentional. Now, with this lined up, what I want to do is go ahead and take my slider, and I know that I am going on it backwards, but that's all right.
The YKK Aqua Guard zipper requires a reverse tab slider.
And I want to go ahead and start my zipper. Starting a zipper takes time to learn how to do. It almost takes more hands than most people have. But let's go ahead and get up to the cover here and see if we're straight. That's pretty good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pull our slider, and we're actually going to come all the way off the end to reconnect our two sides. And the reason we did that is because it's a lot easier to get the zipper fed on if you have a tail like that. Now we've done that, we'll go ahead and put the zipper on the proper direction, which is this way. Okay, and the key here is as you're pushing in, you need to be pulling the zipper apart. So I was pushing the zipper down onto it, and you could push all day long, you're never going to get it. The key is you have to pull apart just gently as you push on, and it'll go right on. Now we'll bring the zipper up there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and cut our tape, cut our zipper tape.
Cut it flush with the bottom edge of the binding.
I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to work a little bit of it in place there, about 3 or 4 lengths worth. Put that in there, trim that off, and I'm going to do the same thing here.
This is one way to create a zipper stop so the slider does not come off.
Just kind of work it in place there. We'll do just to add, it'll be fine. Once again, just trim that off. Trim it off like that. Okay, now we're going to take our hot knife. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to melt just the tail of the zipper, and I'm doing that to keep it from unraveling. I'm being careful not to melt my binding that's behind it. I'm just trying to touch up the zipper chain itself. Now I'm going to take and melt that end, and I really want to take this and get it good and hot and just melt that all in. Obviously you want to do this in a well ventilated area. And what we're doing is we're just basically turning those zipper teeth there into gel to fit together. Just mold that all together. Do the same thing here. Okay, now as far as this plastic that you've created, if you don't really like the shape of it, it's all right. You can just trim it up a little bit with your scissors. That looks a little gooey. And now your zipper slider won't come off. It'll hit the bottom and stop. Got another patch of the 3-inch Shelter-Rite here. And what this is for is this is basically to hide all this nonsense we got going on with the top of our binding. We got an extra thread there. We'll get that out of there. Just silly to have it. And as far as where I'm going to place this, I know that these two seams go alongside and to the top of the lower patch. So I just want to line this up, and I'm going to go right on top of the patch that's underneath.
The Seamstick has been applied to all edges except for the bottom edge. We did not show that in the video.
Now, one other thing to point out with this is our zipper slider could, at this point, come right off the top. If we go to unzip this, it'll go right off the top. So what we're going to do is when we sew, we're going to sew across across, and we're going to go across that. Now when we do this, we're going to do a couple of extra back tacks there. I'm actually going to turn this and start sideways. And then we're going to come down. And we're not going to come all the way down at this. Actually, yeah, we're going to go all the way down the end. And we're actually going to come back about there. Then we'll turn the whole shebang.
As he turns, the needle's buried in the fabric with the foot lifted.
Drop our foot. And then we're going to go across. Now it's important to point out that we're going to be sewing across. There's 2 layers of Shelter-Rite, the layer of Top Gun 1S, our binding, and our zipper. So you have to be really cognizant of what you're sewing through. If you just go crushing through this, you're gonna break a needle and just make a mess of everything. So kind of get up to your binding, and then probably best at this point go ahead and rotate it by hand. And the foot can walk right over that. Needle will punch right through, no problem. And as we go through the zipper, just so it's nice and secure, we're going to go ahead and back tack through the whole thing once again. And go back to forward. And now we're through to where we can just go ahead and sew. And I'm actually just going to sew this backwards just because it's a little bit easier. Since I'm already in there. With our zipper, when we unzip, what will happen is the zipper will go up and it can't go any further. It'll stop right there. But that patch is there to keep everything nice and clean looking. A nice tight zipper. And once again, this is our AquaGuard zipper, so it's got that vinyl coating. When you zip it shut, you can see basically it kind of slams shut here at the top. And so it would be pretty hard for water to intrude there. And water's not going to penetrate through the zipper tape. If you use standard zipper tape and you got a lot of water in here, it would just eventually permeate right through the nylon. The other thing we did here is with the binding, and remember, we spaced our zipper or figured out where our zipper was going to be sewn down without the binding, knowing the binding was going to add a little bit of meat here. What happens then is the binding, when it's shut, basically the binding is nice and closed. It's going to keep almost all the UV away from that zipper and help prolong the life of the zipper.
Our cover's now complete. Brian will snap it on the boat and install the cam lock support poles.
Now here we have the sewn-in boat vent and the cam lock pole. We do have the base on it, which is great because it holds it up nice. On this particular cover, you basically got to cover it and then climb out. So we'll go ahead and stick that up. And actually, our zipper is still zipped, so we might as well unzip it. Oh yeah, that'll be nice. Having the entry. That, and the other thing is now I can grab my handle.
Coming up next is the materials list and the tools that we use to build this Trailerable boat cover using supplies from Sailrite. To make this cover, we used Top Gun 1S. Sailrite also has many other types of great fabrics for covers like this. Be sure to give us a call if you have questions about our fabrics, tools, or supplies. Because we used a fabric that is extremely water resistant and has ample ventilation through our vent caps and ventilators, the area under the cover should be void of excess condensation and moisture. But most importantly, our boat is now protected from the damaging effects of the sun. For more free videos like this, be sure to check out our Sailrite website or subscribe to our Sailrite YouTube channel. It's your loyal patronage to Sailrite that makes these free videos available. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.